April 12, 1861. What if I told you that in the middle of the American Civil War, where bullets screamed and cannons tore the sky apart, some of the most terrifying moments didn't come from the enemy, but from what soldiers couldn't see, couldn't escape, and couldn't forget? Would you believe that the real horror wasn't always the battlefield, but what followed after the smoke cleared? Picture this: a young Union medic, barely 20, crawling through the mud at the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, the single bloodiest day in American history, stepping over bodies stacked so tightly they looked like a wall of flesh, hearing faint whispers from men already presumed dead, reaching out with trembling hands only to realize those voices were coming from soldiers buried alive under their own fallen comrades, gasping for air in the suffocating silence. And yeah, that's where things get real dark, real fast, because war ain't just about glory. It's about survival in places where humanity starts slipping away. Now imagine the smell, thick and sweet, like rot mixed with iron, hanging heavy as the medic tries to decide who gets saved and who gets left behind, because he only has so much time, and every second feels like a lifetime ticking away. And suddenly, a Confederate shell explodes nearby, sending dirt, bone fragments, and shattered screams into the air. And he's thrown to the ground, ears ringing, vision blurred, but he gets back up, because that's what these men did. They kept going, even when their minds were breaking. And here's something most people don't talk about, something you probably never learned. During the winter of 1863, at Battle of Fredericksburg, wounded soldiers lay frozen on the field for days, crying out for help that never came, their voices slowly fading into eerie silence. And survivors later swore they could still hear those cries at night, echoing across the battlefield like ghosts refusing to rest. Yeah, real spine-chilling stuff. And you gotta ask yourself, how do you come back from that? How do you return to normal life after hearing men beg for their mothers as they bleed out in the dirt? And then there's July 1st to 3rd, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg, where over 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. And here's a detail that hits hard. Medics worked non-stop for 3 days and nights, performing amputations without anesthesia for many, using saws that dulled from cutting through bone after bone, stacking severed limbs outside field hospitals until they formed piles taller than a man. And in the dim candlelight, shadows flickered against tent walls, making it look like those piles were moving, shifting, like something alive. And some soldiers later wrote in letters that they couldn't sleep because they kept seeing those shadows, kept hearing the phantom sounds of sawing and screaming, even when everything was quiet. And listen, it wasn't just physical wounds. The mental toll was brutal. Soldiers talked about seeing faces in the smoke, hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there. And some even fired at shadows, convinced the enemy had returned. And that's the kind of psychological warfare nobody signed up for. Now flip the scene to April 6th to 7th, 1862, at the Battle of Shiloh, where rain fell after the battle, washing blood into the soil, creating what survivors described as glowing patches in the dark, a phenomenon later called angel's glow, where wounded soldiers noticed their injuries faintly glowing blue at night. And while science later explained it as bioluminescent bacteria that actually helped prevent infection, imagine being there, lying in the mud, watching your own wound glow in the darkness, not knowing if it was a blessing or something far more sinister. Yeah, that's the kind of moment that sticks with you, makes you question everything. And here's something wild. During the Siege of Vicksburg, from May 18th to July 4th, 1863, civilians and soldiers alike lived in caves dug into hillsides to escape constant bombardment. And inside those cramped dark spaces, people reported hearing scratching noises, whispers, even when no one was speaking. And some believed it was just rats. Others weren't so sure, because fear does things to your mind. It turns shadows into threats, silence into something loud. And in those caves, time lost meaning, days blurred into nights, and the outside world felt like a distant nightmare you couldn't wake up from. And let's not forget the medics again. because these guys were the real unsung heroes, rushing into gunfire to pull wounded men back, sometimes getting shot themselves, sometimes dying right beside the soldiers they were trying to save. And one account from 1864 during the Overland Campaign describes a medic who continued treating patients even after being wounded, tying his own arm with a tourniquet while using the other to operate, cracking jokes to keep morale up, saying things like, "Well, boys, I guess I'm getting a taste of my own medicine," and somehow making men laugh in the middle of absolute chaos. Because humor, believe it or not, was one of the few things that kept them sane. And that's the human side of war. The part where courage and madness walk side by side. And here's the kicker. Even after the war ended on April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Court House surrender, the horror didn't just stop. Veterans carried those memories home, many suffering from what we now recognize as PTSD, though back then they just called it soldier's heart or nervous disease. And people didn't really understand it, didn't know how to treat it. So these men were left to deal with nightmares, flashbacks, and that constant feeling of being back on the battlefield, hearing gunfire in their sleep, seeing faces of fallen friends every time they closed their eyes. And some couldn't handle it. Some turned to alcohol, others isolated themselves, and a few simply disappeared from society altogether. And that's the part of history that doesn't always make it into textbooks. The lasting scars that no one could see. The battles that kept going long after the last shot was fired. So when you think about the American Civil War, don't just think about generals and strategies. Think about the medic crawling through mud under fire, the soldier hearing voices in the dark, the glowing wounds, the whispers in caves, the laughter that masked fear, and the silence that followed it all. Because that's where the real story lives. Raw, unfiltered, and honestly, kind of haunting. And now, I gotta ask you, if you were there, surrounded by that chaos, that fear, that unexplainable darkness, would you have had the courage to keep going? Or would the war have followed you home too, just like it did for so many others?